Welcome to Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our week in review. Baltic World is a channel where we discuss important issues facing Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Before we begin, how are you, Crispin?
I'm good. Feeling fit and healthy. Had a bit of a makeover. Had a good Christmas. And so everything is winding up well for the end of the year. And
it's crazy. Almost end of 2022. It's going quick.
It really has. A lot has happened this year. Couldn't have predicted where we would end up. I think that would be true for both of us in terms of, if we guessed on our bingo card what the end of 2022 would look like. We're very far away from it, but not in an unpleasant way. It's quite a pleasant surprise that we are now fully developed with the new studio and ready for 2023, where we're going to really ramp up production. I know I keep saying that, but there's been a sort of a hurry up and wait feel about this, where it took just so many months to get everything going. But now I'm very pleased with where we've ended up. I think we've got a good launching pad for next year. What about you?
Yeah, it's been really good. I had a great Christmas, ate all the food. I don't know about traditions over the Baltic for Christmas, but in Australia it's hot. So people go to the beach. I basically stayed in the aircon and started drinking at 10. Who knows? Like, there's only one day you're going to do it, right? So I love going to the end of the year because it kind of makes you, it provides you some time to reflect on the years just past. And like you said, I could never have imagined being here where I am now after 2022. It's been a roller coaster. Obviously, we came from the pandemic and then they were opening it up and then I got to go to Europe and all the things. Like, it's insane. But yes, we've kind of put almost like the foundation for next year to be a very exciting year. So I wanted to spend this time going through some comments from the year, and I put together about like a week ago calling for some comments. So I'm gonna basically rapid fire some comments to you, Crispin. Some are short, some are long. That's okay. And so our first comment, very easy, is Vitus asks, are you planning your next trip to the Baltics? Or are you planning a new trip to the Baltics?
We are, aren't we? So Charlene's parents have fallen in love with the Baltic, and so they want to go. And of course, if they go, then Charlene obviously needs to go, and it would make sense then for us to make a proper trip of it. In June is the current plan. I mean, I might be there before then because I do have to be in Europe well before then for a couple of reasons. Yeah. So there might be a possibility of getting to the Baltic prior to that, but certainly come the middle of the year, summer, beautiful time of year to be in the Baltic, be able to get some better photos and things because everything will be deep, lush and green and really showcase what it's like at that time of year. And Charlene hasn't been at that time of year either, so it'll be a really good opportunity to go and when it's in full bloom.
Exactly. We didn't go basically at the end of winter to just spring. So I'll be really excited. Yeah, as soon as we landed back in Australia from our first Baltic trip, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And my mum obviously follows the channel. Shout out to mum. And she was like, when are you going again? When's the next trip? I'm going to come. The kind of impression. So I'm really excited. And I've kind of made a list of places I already want to go to. And so hopefully, next year I'll because I know I've been to Europe before prior to this year. So now that I kind of have a better idea that I know it's safe and somewhat easy to get around, it's going to make me a bit more prepared to go to Europe. Great.
And as I keep telling everybody, and everybody who watches this channel, but also in real life, the Baltic has everything that people want about Europe. So amazing culture, history, architecture, landscapes, natural beauty, and none of the things that people dislike. Tourist traps, crowds, things that are overpriced, smelly, dirt, none of those things. It's all clean, pristine, and classic. So definitely, if you are thinking about going to the Baltic, if you're not from that region, you watch this channel, definitely go because as I said, if you have a vision of what Europe is like and you go to France or Austria or somewhere like that, it doesn't reflect that at all. You go, it's nice, but it was a bit overrun, a bit cliche.
Yeah.
But when you go to the Baltic, it's a truly authentic experience. And I've said this before as well, that when I took Charlene to the Baltic, we had been working on Baltic World for 6-7 months before that. And my biggest fear is that her interest would immediately die off. I'm like, well, yes, I know it's a beautiful place. I have a passion for it. But when people go to Europe, they go to these other places typically, particularly for their first trip. And we did end up having one day stopover in a more, let's say, traditionally touristed city. What was that, Charlene?
I've forgotten. What was that?
Vienna.
Oh, yes.
Pretty forgettable though.
Yeah, that's why I was like, yes, we did stop over Vienna for, I think because our layover was so long, so we could actually we keep our luggage at the airport and just take the train in. And I thought it would be wonderful. I've heard so many good things about Vienna, that it's like one of the great place to live and it's friendly and there's lots of things to do. But when we got there, it had no soul in some ways. I remember even getting a meal there, and the staff was so rude in some ways that they were just expecting you to tip and just basically like squeeze you out of all the money you have. Whereas when you go to the Baltic, you're basically treated like a friend, as someone that people, when we went to restaurants in the Baltic, everyone was so welcoming, and they're like, you can try this, you try that, and they were genuinely want to give you recommendations to really share their culture and their history. Whereas when we went to Vienna, it was kind of like McDonald's in some ways, like the McDonald's version of Europe. So you've got the cool architecture around you, but do you want to pay for this photo for 50 euros? Kind of the impression. So
yeah, no insult to the Austrians. It wasn't the Austrians that were at issue. We didn't actually meet many Austrians when we were in Vienna. Because it was just so overrun with crowds of people everywhere, and it just wasn't at all pleasant. But that was the thing. God. Like,
do you remember there was like the Australian restaurant?
Oh yes.
In Vienna. I got it for the picture. I'm not going to hunt for it. There was like an Australian restaurant. You're like, wow, we're so exotic, Crispin.
Yeah. Well, Vienna actually does look aesthetically a bit like Melbourne. I always find there's similarities. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't impressed. And I've been there to Vienna before, and I wasn't that impressed last time, although I did do a few more specifically cultural things when I was there, so it was a bit better. But yeah, I'm glad that we had that contrast, because it also was validating for myself in my own head that no, the Baltic really is special. Like, it's not just that I have this weird fetish. The Baltic, in my opinion, is just a lot better than the typically touristed places like France and Austria and some parts of Italy, although Italy is very nice. It just definitely go and do it. If you haven't been to the Baltic, if you kind of think, oh, why would I go there? You'll go there and you will think, oh my goodness, this is what I was looking for the whole time. I absolutely guarantee it.
Yeah, for sure. Agree. Okay, next question. Romanus Varbolis. This is an interesting question, Crispin.
All right.
When I read it, I thought this is kind of funny. How do you feel about the ability of being a prophet in your own country? They are saying that to produce something interesting, there must be a good mixture of familiar and weird. Are you feeling this by yourselves? The local culture should be pretty familiar, but quite alien as well. How often do you find yourself shaking your head at cultural differences?
Wow, there's a lot in that question and many different ways I could answer it. I mean, first of all, thank you for the compliment. It's very kind. So just on a personal myself, I mean, I'm mostly an analyst. If I was to give myself a profession, I would look at things in the international sphere, geopolitics, grand strategy. And in order to be an analyst, there are certain skills that you should obtain. One is a knowledge of history, and not just the history you learn in school, but the history of every country that you're looking at. So it's important to know the history, obviously, of the Baltic countries. But if you're looking at different parts of the world, the history of Japan, of the Philippines, of Korea, of Spain, of Brazil, of the United States. These things are very important because they help shape cultural identity and what they perceive as their own interests and what they're likely to do in various situations. So I'm not a prophet by any stretch. I have no more knowledge of the future of anybody else. What I do is I just take information that's available, put it in the context of the patterns of their own history. And it's very important to not inject yourself too much into it. I think being an Australian...
What do you mean by that?
So being an Australian is a bit of an advantage in that respect because we don't have that long a European history. We definitely have an identity and culture, but we have so much foreign influence. It's harder for Americans because America, when you're there, the noise of America is so loud. It's harder to put yourself in the perspectives of others. So, for example, if you're in the United States and all you're hearing is news that is local and movies that are made locally and comedy that's all local, it's harder to imagine yourself as someone from Lithuania or Estonia or China or wherever. Whereas if you're in Australia where most of what you're consuming culturally comes from other places, it's a little bit easier. So what I say is, don't inject yourself. I mean, read the history of other places, the culture of other places, the things that they venerate and their creativity, their art, and use a form of cognitive empathy, as in, if I was Polish and I was raised in this environment, what would be some of the things that I would value, and how in politics would I project that through my policies? So there is a certain type of empathy, not an empathy that means that you feel a greater sense of sympathy and compassion than you would for people locally. That's not realistic. But things that are just imagining yourself in a different place. And that's, I think, easier for Australians generally because we have so much foreign influence. Over 200 languages are spoken in Australia every day. We are, in my view, probably the most successful multicultural society in the world. So in terms of multicultural societies, there'd be probably 10 or so that I'd say is truly multi-ethnic, multilingual. And of those, Australia is the most successful. So you'd have countries like the United States, Israel, places like that with different groups of people all together. And, Australia is just way, way more stable than most of these places. And so, it's very, very helpful. So that was the sort of first part of the question and profit part. What was the second part?
There's a saying that to produce something interesting, there must be a good mixture of familiar and weird. Are you feeling this by yourself? And then goes on, the local culture should be pretty familiar but quite alien as well. How often do you find yourself shaking your head at cultural differences?
Oh, okay. So I've been very lucky to be exposed to a wide variety of cultures. Where I am currently in the world is a culture that's very different to my own, and very different to the cultures that I have been around otherwise. So there is nothing, there is always going to be a combination of familiar and alien because the familiar is universal. Everybody cares about their families, their careers, their children. They have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Whereas there are differences in terms of tradition, in values, in modes of behavior. Things that you emphasize as being important will differ from place to place. And I was thinking about this this morning when, we've been talking a lot about The Witcher, and some people have been complaining about it, but some people have been very grateful that we've talked about The Witcher. I'm one of them. The thing that frustrates me is that in The Witcher, you've got all these different ethnicities, cultures, races together in one melting pot with no rhyme or reason. And the only difference between them is how they look and how they sound. Whereas if I was running Netflix, I would really encourage diversity at the program level, as in you want to tell stories from Korea, from Japan, from the Philippines, from Spain, from Portugal, the Baltic, wherever, Africa, and have shows that really put you in a time and place. Ancient Egypt, conquistador Cuba, all these sorts of different environments and settings, and show a wide range of diversity through your programs. But within each individual program, you have it as homogenous as it needs to be in order for it to make sense and be accessible. When you have a mix of familiar and weird, that's true for any story. If you are watching Lord of the Rings or reading Lord of the Rings, there are things that are really weird, right? Things that you would not be able to empathize with or imagine particularly well. But the themes of the characters and the story and the narrative and the relationships and struggles, they're something that is made familiar. And through that window, you get access to a whole other way of being. So we as people are much more similar than we are different. And the differences that exist allow us, if communicated in the right way, to expand our experience. I'll give you just one example. Even with Russia is, a real problem for the world right now. And yet we have to acknowledge the cultural contribution that Russia has made to the world. Russia has the best literary author, full stop. I mean, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are the best, 1 and 2 respectively. And some of the composers, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, some of the poets, Lermontov, Pushkin, they're extraordinary. And it's a product of their extreme environment, their extreme experience. We are bequeathed great benefit from that. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was composed during the siege of Leningrad. So he was stranded in the siege. 1 million civilians died in what is now St. Petersburg as the Nazi war machine surrounded the city, bombarded it every single day for 3 years almost. And that is one of the most powerful bits of music ever. So the Russian resilience to extreme conditions, extreme weather, extreme privation, or in the case of its government, extreme tyranny, allows us to have some understanding of Russian threat perceptions, of Russian, they think that the whole world is out to get them, that they have to do these forms of aggression, lash out, and to do so, that gives them a feeling of strength in a kind of very narcissistic, malignant way, because although they as individuals feel completely small and worthless because their lives are worth nothing, they're part of a great country. It's the biggest country in the world and a massive state and extraordinarily powerful, and the rest of the world should respect Russia, the motherland, that they all pride themselves in sacrificing for. And also they're all raised on the idea of the Second World War, a country that lost more people than the entire rest of the world combined in that war, some 28 million people. And so they all kind of venerate this as an idea of sacrificing oneself for this perception that is Russia, without much regard for anybody else. And so there is a real personality disorder, psychosis, that is underpinning some of its aggressive behaviors, including in Ukraine. But at the same time, that same dysfunction is allowed us to get all this cultural benefit in the form of literature, art, music, architecture, that as humans, we have benefited from and should pay attention to. So, yeah, I do shake my head a lot, but I think it's mostly because people don't understand what culture is, what real diversity is, and why these things are useful and important to understand.
I don't really have a question here. It's just more of a comment. Benny, a guy from Poland, I just want to say hello. It's been a long time. I'm so glad you're well. Hope you are well. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Yeah, because he always comments on our videos, comments for stats. And I remember.
Yeah, that's not us. There's no one we know that's like trying to, push the channel or anything. It's just someone who's watches the channel and comments.
Yeah.
And
so next time, like when we're in Poland, let's go grab a beer.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I also want to give a shout out to Mrs. Cute As. So in your recent Ukraine video, she says, doing something on a united front is better than doing nothing at all. And I think this was a great comment.
Yeah, I remember this comment. It was in response to the oil price cap that was agreed between the different players. And I was reviewing whether or not an oil price cap buying from Russia oil just below a certain price would be effective, given that the price cap has been placed well above the current price of oil. And I was arguing that it's better than where we are now and that it's a step forward. And I think that comment is exactly right. That in this particular case, when we're talking about something so universally consumed with multiple suppliers in a seller's market, which is what oil invariably is, because everybody needs oil, but only a few countries have it in abundant quantities, that having any agreement is better than none and also a breakthrough. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we should wait for some countries when it comes to certain things. So, for example, providing Ukraine with military capabilities, listening to the Germans and the French complain about it all the time is grating, and I just don't think we should worry about them. We should just move forward, and they will be dragged along by that inertia. But when it comes to commercial side of things, particularly when we're talking universally consumed energy sources, then any agreement is better than none, because you can't just do that through coercion. If one country decides to go it alone, they can make their own deals with Russia. They can get their oil from other sources. If other suppliers want to break sanctions, they can do so. They can combine oil sourced from Russia with their own oil and then sell it off to third countries. So there are ways around it. Whatever you can do to get some agreement that people are likely to stick to and they've publicly signed up to, and there'll be some verification to ensure it, then that's a positive step.
Yeah, great. And then so one video we did this year was about Baltic inflation because of the Ukraine war. I also want to give a shout out to Archers Bondars. In one of our videos we did about Baltic inflation, and he's really shared so honestly and openly about how it's affected him and the way he votes. So thank you.
Yeah, that's one thing that people in the Baltic should feel more comfortable talking about. There seems something churlish about complaining about prices going up when there's a war going on. So, for example, the contrast that can always be made, let's say you're concerned about fuel prices, grocery prices. You say, well, what about the people in Ukraine who are fighting for their lives, fighting for their land, being killed by the Russians? And there's a sort of inherent guilt trip
Of
in
course.
that. Now, it's not very effective when we're talking to the United States, for example, because they don't see the war in Ukraine as being a primary reason for why their prices are going up, because it's so far away.
But it feels more real if your country has been occupied before.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not saying it's not a valid point to make, but I'm saying that you can disentangle the ethics of saying I'm concerned about the inflation, the amount that it's putting people into poverty, people who can't afford it, people falling behind, and the war in Ukraine as separate things. Yes, obviously the war is having an impact on prices across the board. And it's disproportionately impacting the Baltic for that reason. But at the same time, the governments in the Baltic should be doing whatever they can to reduce the impact of that cost. There's a bit of an alarm going off in the background, so I apologize to the audience for that. And not to simply say you're a bad person for being upset about inflation, because that's one response. Another response is like, well, it's Putin's war. It's Putin's fault that this is happening. And I think that's politically expedient because it takes the responsibility off politicians from actually doing things, implementing policies to bring cost of living down. And the Baltic leadership could absolutely do more to tackle inflation. They should. And so there should be no there should be no guilt in saying we think these prices are unacceptable, because that doesn't mean that you don't support Ukraine. It doesn't mean that you support Putin's Russia or anything like that. It's just completely separate statements. And acknowledging the real world impact that these energy prices and things are having on people is just being cognizant of the damage that's being done and forces people to think about the policies that might alleviate some of that pain. Hats off to Artur. So I remember left a comment that was very direct about the impact that this was having on everyday Latvians. And we should be talking about this. We shouldn't shy away from it. It's not unpatriotic to be concerned about these expenses. It might give you some kind of confidence that you're suffering and but you're doing it for good reason.
Yeah.
That's helpful, but insufficient. There are things that governments could do to help, and
but I just kind of comes across like the problem is so systemic that will it even change anything with even the cost of living rising more generally? I don't know. I guess it helps to put pressure on your politicians to do something.
Well, I'm an absolute heretic when it comes to the European Union. I think that integration of markets and things like that can be beneficial. Free trade and so forth is generally positive. However, there are two things that I think that have really hurt the smaller countries, particularly the Baltic. One is the Eurozone, because it means that the euro is going to be tied primarily to the economies that are the largest, so Germany, for example. And that means that the value of the euro relative to individual earnings in countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania is going to be disproportionately bad, disproportionately negative, meaning that things are going to be more expensive in those countries relative to what people can actually afford. Whereas if you have your own currency, those currencies fluctuate based on market conditions. So that was a big problem that Greece had with the debt crisis, that it was having to get into debt with euros, which no one could afford. If the Greeks were on the drachma, the currency would have massively depreciated. Everything would have become cheaper. That would have made their exports far more competitive, encouraged tourism, people to go there because it would be a cheap holiday. And that would help boost the economy and get them out of the debt crisis. Whereas being stuck with the euro, it doesn't leave them anywhere to go. It really is up to Germany. The only time that these countries benefit is if the economies in Germany and in Italy and Spain tank. And these countries are doing well by comparison. This was kind of an advantage that Ireland did have for a brief while when Ireland, its economy was booming relative to the other European powers, but its country was small, so its impact on the euro was limited. But that also led to a massive housing bubble as all the cheap property in Ireland was bought out, and then there was a huge crash, and now Ireland is one of the weakest economies in Europe for that reason. So the euro is not responsive to market conditions for smaller players. And related to that is the free movement of people. Everybody from the Baltic, all the young people, particularly those that had gone to university, got educated, they went out to the Western countries where they could get much better incomes. Now, that would be okay if they all repatriated quickly. Like if you go overseas for a few years, save up money, then come back and spend it, that's actually a good thing, right? Because you're, bringing in money, taking the skills and things that you've learned from other places and applying them at home, broadening your perspective and building networks and links and things with other places. This is all excellent stuff from a human capital perspective, but you have to come home. The remittances have to return. But if you permanently moved out of the Baltic, then all you have is a massive brain drain, huge exodus of young people, terrible population decline, huge demographic problems because the workforce shrinks. And so the people remaining who are earning less are having to pay for the aged care services through their taxes and everything. It's a kind of a death spiral. And so there is, I think, a big burden or rather responsibility on the EU as a whole to alleviate some of the cost of living pressures on these Baltic countries, because they're benefiting from the fact that these Baltic countries are dragging down the value of the euro. And so they should be doing more to reduce the cost of living pressures in those countries that are
and the surrounding Eastern European countries are already doing so much like this year for the Ukrainians. They've opened up all their borders. I know all the EU countries have, but like, to be honest, across the border, you go to the Baltic and all Eastern European countries first. So these Western allies should be doing way more. It's just absolutely amazing just how the Baltic countries have gone above and beyond their capacity to take in all these Ukrainian refugees, despite having energy costs, despite the cost of living increasing. And I remember even getting messages from our subscribers saying, my family and I are looking to see, what families need help, is anything we can do. It's just quite incredible. And I think, these Western allies should do more.
Yes, I think you draw attention to something that isn't talked about anywhere near enough, Charlene. It's a very good point. What everyday people in the Baltic countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania are doing to help Ukrainians. I mean, and as you say, many of our viewers, subscribers, they have Ukrainians in their home right now that they're putting up and opening to refugees, women and children. So, and think about what's happening with the Ukrainian population. Ukraine is 40-something million people. The entire Baltic together is about 10 million, less than that. Poland is 20-something million, 28 million. So Ukraine is half the population of the region. And then if you've got the fighting age males staying in Ukraine, so 80-something% of the refugees are female with children. So that they need the support. And that support is being handed out in spades, open arms by these countries. Now, of course, the EU is doing things to help. It's not just completely closing off to, and many Ukrainians are finding their place elsewhere. But Poland brought in 3 million Ukrainians in the first months of the war. That's a massive impact. And the EU should be bringing down, because I mean, if you think about what life is like for you, you're in Latvia, let's say, you've got a family, so your own family, wife, children, husband, and then you open your doors, you bring in a Ukrainian who has 2 children, and the government is supporting you a little bit, but the cost of living has increased in that time dramatically.
It's tough.
What do you do? Like you yeah. And I just think this is another problem with the EU. I have a lot of criticism of the EU. One of the problems with the EU is the disconnect between people in the European Parliament and the ordinary people. One of the benefits of representative democracy is that there is someone who is specifically there for you. You know, you have a local electorate, you go to your local member and say, look, I've got this problem. And that member speaks for you in the parliament on your behalf. Whereas in the European Parliament, it's all proportional representation. So, you know, you'll have some people from Latvia, some people from the Netherlands, some people from Luxembourg or whatever, and I'm actually not sure if Luxembourg is in the EU. It's a curious question. Maybe someone leave a comment below and let me know. But there's no one specifically for you personally. They're just representing the entire country. And so individual stories like this are going to be lost, except, you know, from what they themselves let people know. But they're too busy because they're trying to look after everything.
So, agreed. Yeah, and also, I've got a couple more comments. I guess linked to that is, I'm so sorry, I can't say your name. Kodilovska Dinoza.
Oh, yes, I know the one. Yeah. I always think Komodo dragon in my head when I see that name. I don't know why.
Komodo dragon gave a really great comprehensive breakdown of voting and the current Lithuanian politics, and how many Lithuanians again absorb those taking on these rising energy costs, understanding that it will take time to recover. And it will just be interesting to see what the next election brings. So I'll put the comment here. I can't go through it all. We've been limited to time. But thank you so much for sharing those insights.
Yeah.
And also,
I'll just make one quick comment, very quick comment.
Okay.
Is that it'll be interesting to see the shape of Baltic politics once the Ukraine war has ended. And yet many of the economic problems remain, because at the moment the war is obscuring some of the structural problems in the economies of these countries. And it's unclear at this stage what is directly a product of the war and all its ramifications, and what are things that are the product of policies. And the big struggle, I would really like to see Latvia catch up as quickly as possible with the other two Baltic countries. And I think it's entirely possible. I don't see there's any reason why that couldn't happen, other than, you know, policy decisions. So things like that. Komodo's comment just sort of prompted that thought that at the moment the Baltic has this unifying force that is the war. But once that's over, many of the problems will remain, and it'll be clear as to what the responsibilities are, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the politics.
Just on this, so it raises that there is some dissatisfaction with the current Lithuanian government. Yeah, also talks about same-sex marriage laws. So the Baltic are very conservative in these ways. I don't know if I open up a can of worms. I don't know.
Definitely.
But it's just so.
But you know, it's the end of the year. I mean, first of all, there is stark differences in different places. Probably no more so than Vilnius and Kaunas, which is only 80 minutes away on a train from each other.
Yeah.
And yet, wildly different views on this subject. The people that we met in Vilnius tended to lean more towards pro same-sex marriage, and I don't recall meeting anyone in Kaunas that, at least in discussions with me, was openly for it. I think this is a big discussion, because underneath that headline question, should same-sex marriage be legalized in the Baltic? Should it be universal? I mean, it's legal in Australia now. That's underneath that is a stronger cultural question.
Sure.
We don't go around to Arabic countries and expect them to embrace same-sex marriage. Remember what happened with Qatar recently. There was all this kind of signaling and, you know, politicking, but the audiences were all at home. They weren't people in the Arab world. And again, when we talk about ethno-states and things like that, these small pockets of culture are important to preserve: language, history, identity. But we're much harsher when it comes to the Baltic on these issues because they're part of the EU and they are of a
Yeah.
certain ethnic demographic, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't see, like, my honest view is you have to be careful about radically changing things. Okay.
Mm.
On the one hand, the Baltic world is this wonderful, unique defender of Western liberal tradition because they understand the experience of Soviet occupation. They understand authoritarianism, the importance of democracy, the importance of freedom of speech. Then they are in some ways more Western than ourselves because they're Westerners who believe in the West that aren't going through this
Yeah.
crisis of confidence that I was telling you about in the Anglo world. The arguments for and against same-sex marriage definitely don't have time for today. That's something that I'll probably discuss perhaps in another channel. But what I would say is that the resistance to same-sex marriage, the fact that so many people are against it in Baltic countries, is not a reflection on their, social acceptance, social views, anything like that. I think it's purely they've got an identity and a culture which they want to preserve in all kinds of ways. It extends beyond marriage. It goes to
Yeah, of course.
their
The family unit and everything else.
the family,
Yeah,
the family
that
unit
counts,
and
yeah.
religion. But even aside from the traditionally, cultural heritage stuff, but just also like the fact that they've got these freedom of institutions and that they've got their language that they want to preserve and expand. The fact that they're concerned about ongoing Soviet monuments and things like that. They want to venerate national heroes and look at their history through that lens. It's more about preserving things that are unique to them. In other words, they see same-sex marriage as a foreign colonial influence. Okay.
I see.
And there's some foreign colonial influences are positive. I'm not saying that same-sex marriage is good or bad here, but it's from the perspective of these small countries who have only recently got their freedom back. I remember, for example, when Poland in 2008, 2009, the Americans were putting in air defense systems into Poland. And there was strong resistance from many Poles about this, which is hard to imagine today. Like all these countries now want more American presence and more military capability and so forth. But the resistance came from the Poles because they had recently gained their liberation from Soviet occupation. They didn't want any foreign countries influencing them at all, and that included foreign military presence on their territory. Definitely not the case now. These countries want to have all the advanced American gear, as many Americans on the ground in their territory as possible to deter Russia. But at the time, that was a really, really controversial move, even though politically the Poles aligned closely with the United States. It was purely because they didn't want any foreigners trudging on their land, something that they were all too familiar with and sensitive about. And because same-sex marriage isn't indigenous to their countries, it's never existed in their societies before, it's obviously a foreign idea, well, it's going to be treated with some skepticism because it's a foreign idea and not something that they've had any personal experience with. So I don't look at that in terms of, and yes, people will say, oh, the religious aspect, and of course, people have all their different reasons for being against it. But I think that the underlying emotion is preserving those things that are unique about their own culture, like we were talking about before. And so I don't have an issue with it. I mean, I think that
it's really interesting just how these different policies, it's not just like, it's not the policy itself. Sometimes it's like the institution that might be influenced and changed, and people are scared of, I guess, the consequences of that. Where do you kind of stop? And I kind of think we see that in Western society is like, because of same-sex marriage, we kind of see this uptick in other cultural wars.
Well, yes, and that's
arguably, but I don't know.
I mean, obviously we're moving out of the scope now, but it's definitely the reason why we are having these battles about gender identity and trans issues and so on is because same-sex marriage is legal. If same-sex marriage was not legal in the West, then all the people that are arguing about this would be arguing still about the same-sex marriage issue. That would be the battleground, the cultural battleground. But these people have nothing to do, right? They've won their battle, and so they have to find something else to be outrageous about. Otherwise, it become totally irrelevant. And in fact, whether same-sex marriage has negative aspects and consequences, again, another discussion. But one thing that definitely is having negative impact in some ways, I don't know in total, but in some ways, is euthanasia. There are very permissive laws in euthanasia in the Netherlands and Canada. There was a woman recently in Canada who went to the doctors because she wanted a mobility scooter or something like that, a mobility frame. And they offered her euthanasia instead, right?
What?
Yeah, you can look it up.
What?
There's all these memes about how, there was the funny gun meme where it's like the best we can offer is, it's like, oh, I need a mobility scooter. We need a mobility scooter. And the guy's like, the best we can offer is death.
Not true.
Or people who in the Netherlands who are not terminally ill or just mentally depressed are getting euthanasia. So the whole slippery slope arguments used to be considered like a fallacy. It used to be thought of as slippery slope. We're not talking about things that might happen in the future. We're talking about the here and now. A doesn't necessarily mean B, but these aren't fallacies. We've seen in places where the state has allowed people to die, originally for very, human, compassionate reasons, and now that system is becoming almost an economic model, where people, So I think we have to be careful about changing things in societies which have been around for a long time, and I don't begrudge the Baltic peoples who want to see what happens first when it comes to same-sex marriage. But again, look, I don't. There are plenty of people who think that the Baltic is stuck in the dark ages with this stuff, and needs to catch up with the rest of humanity from their point of view. And certainly, I mean, here is something I would say. I personally don't think there is a pressing need for same-sex marriage in the Baltic, but the prejudices that are against gays and lesbians in the Baltic should be lessened. The stigmas should be removed, because we have an issue when it comes to suicide in the Baltic. Those rates are obscenely high. I'm not saying that it's directly related to homosexuality or anything like that, but it can't help. There is a culture of bullying that many people in Lithuania told us about, and we will be doing. And I want to thank certain people at the right time for their fantastic contributions to the research on that. We will be doing a big special on that early in the new year. By and large, who you're attracted to is a product of your nature, who you're, So people can't control who they're attracted to. And if they're consenting adults and, age of consent, all of that stuff, then there's nothing wrong with acting out those attractions if done in an ethical way.
I'm glad we could address that with some tact.
Yeah, we'll see how it looks. You really threw us in the fire. Usually I'm the one to do that.
I'm just like, can't wait to get cancelled. No.
Usually I'm the one to do that. We're gonna have a flame war.
Yeah, just put the gasoline on top and just like double the gasoline. Okay. I think that's we had one more. Let me see. There are so many good comments, and I can't get to them all. But I mean, on that with the maintain culture, I feel like we're on this theme. I'm so sorry. I've got to apologise in advance for your screen name. Kilpotages? Cilpotajas?
Good luck.
with Hippolytus. Their comments here. It's like, can we or should we treat language as some sort of security mechanism, and to what degree to regulate who is residing in country? Historically, majority ethnic group establishes country and that language becomes an official language of the state. Progressive argument usually goes like minorities should have rights, so that, in my opinion, would allow for minorities to grow unintegrated and become a separate identity. Also, then becomes very vulnerable to foreign influence.
Okay, it's a great question, and might have to do a whole video on this subject because it is really deep. Again, I think it comes down to the size of the country. These languages, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, it's astonishing that these languages still exist. It is through the sacrifices of people who at great personal risk to themselves, and eventually we will finish the History of Lithuania series, which will cover the book carriers and people like that, that has allowed these languages to survive. And these languages have survived despite state-orchestrated attempts to stamp them out. Okay, so it's not just that they were dying out because of exposure to other groups. So, for example, Cornish died out in the UK in the late 1700s, not because there was a state orchestrated mandate. No one can speak Cornish. It's just that Cornish fell into disuse, and the same could well have been true of these languages. These languages that are ancient, by the way, they're extremely unique, and thus doing things to preserve those languages I have no problem with, because it's not just something for their own national identity. It's a gift for the whole world. I love listening to Estonian and Latvian and Lithuanian. It's really has a lyrical quality. They're different from one another, but they all sound great. It doesn't sound like German. And
what I love is just how close I guess because I live in Australia and it's so big. What I love is just these countries are so close together, and yet their languages are quite different. When we were traveling, I was finding and learning how to say hello and how are you in one language, and then suddenly I had to switch brains to have a different ear for another language. So it's incredible how far they've gone to preserve their language and culture.
Exactly. But then there's the next question is, how far should the state go in ensuring it? And there is a boundary there, I think. For example, if you mandate that all schools must teach in the native language, and I'm flashing now, so dice in, but all schools must teach in the native language, I don't have a problem with that. I think that everybody should be able to speak the native language who is a citizen or learn it. I think that the citizenship tests should be in the native language, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's all fine. But then if you take steps to say you can't speak a particular language in certain settings, you can't speak a language in university or at work or in government or whatever, that's discriminatory. And there might be people who are just as patriotic, just as loyal, just every bit as much a citizen of the state as anybody else, but are just more comfortable speaking a particular language because it's easier for them, right? And if you're trying to deal with government and both people speak Russian and the person's trying to fill out forms and understand, the complexities of tax or whatever, and they're less likely to make a mistake if people are communicating in a language that they both understand, that's fine. I just think that you don't become an oppressor yourself, is what I'm saying. You don't want to. You take the lessons of what's been done to you and you use that to be more empathetic, more compassionate, strict in ensuring that the language is preserved and extended, and that over time, just through that process, more and more people in the country, more percentage of the population will be speaking the native language all of the time, but not go beyond the bounds to something that is actively oppressive. And I think that's dangerous because you give critics ammunition to go after you. You don't want to feed into the Russian victim narrative, if we just talk about Russia. And so, yeah, things like that. So there's just a line there. There's a common sense line, and you don't want to go too far. But, making sure all the signs are in the native language.
There's
and
not a
all
way,
the,
like, you can just promote
forms
it, basically.
That's all good. Oop, I'm
Oh,
out of battery.
damn.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. You still have my audio, so you can just have me as a blank screen.
Okay, I'm just going to... So, Crispin's run out of battery for his camera, and then he's lost his spare battery. So you just have me to look at. I mean, that's fine. So you've got Crispin as a still image for the rest of this video. But we're basically at time, more or less. Unless there's anything you want to add, but...
Oh, well, just no, thank you for a wonderful year. And thank you, Charlotte.
Really?
Actually.
Oh.
And,
thank you.
Yeah. Thankfully, you can't see the face I'm pulling. But no, but honestly, this channel, and I've said it many times before, for all you guys at home, there is zero chance that I'd still be doing this. Zero chance I'd still be doing this if Charlene wasn't doing all the hard yards behind the scenes, doing the shorts, doing the, you'll see some new thumbnails, just so much research.
I am your accountability buddy.
It's an astonishing. Yeah, making sure that I get stuff done because she'll be on my
Pretty
back.
much.
But more than that, it's the enthusiasm that I see reflected in Charlene as well. That it gives me motivation. Part of the motivation obviously comes from the community and people letting us know how things are going, giving us their insights. But on a day-to-day basis, behind the scenes, away from the channel, Charlene has been the biggest inspiration. And so no one could be more lucky to be doing a YouTube channel than with Charlene. I don't understand people who can do it by themselves, who have that internal motivation. That's fantastic. I have the interest, I have the subject matter interest, and I like talking about it, and it's a great pleasure responding to feedback. But at the end of the day, it's 99.9% perspiration.
Yeah, agreed.
And Charlene carries a very big whip, so very good.
I can see you on video calls. So I was like, everybody just keep talking. Don't.
Yeah, no, but honestly, it's a great joy and a privilege, and I have no idea how any of this could have got done without you. So thank you very much for a wonderful 2022.
Thank you.
And I hope that in 2023, you'll go a bit easier on me than this.
I'll try.
Not this no,
yeah.
Right.
No, it's been a pleasure, honestly, working with Crispin on this channel, and it's been a pleasure being with you guys as well. I've learned so much, even though I feel like it's been a bit up and down. Again, we've paved the path for next year to be an incredible year. So thank you for sticking with us on this. It's really made my year. Learnt more. Would never expect to have done what we've done this year, but here we are. Any questions, feedback, let us know. Thank you for all your comments. Couldn't get to them all today, but I just want to highlight just a few. But we do read every single one of your comments, 100%. There are some comments that are so long, and I'm thinking to myself, I need Crispin's input to make sure we have our response well considered. So thank you. Just thank you so much from my heart. And
thank you everyone for the recent Witcher comments as well. Some of those were extraordinarily long, and I was glad it wasn't just in my own head. Like I associate the Witcher lore with the Baltic region and the Polish region. So I consider, for example, the Nilfgaardians to be Teutonic Knights, Regania to be Poles, the Elves to be Lithuanians. Like I think it all mirrors very, very well. And
we could do a video on that.
So
that could be a video. It's like, if people aren't tired of talking about The Witcher, we could do that, because we did have a good comment about there should be better linkage. Otherwise, have a wonderful, this will be after Christmas. Hope you had a wonderful Christmas and a fabulous new year, and we'll see you in 2023. I'm going to say ciao for now, Crispin.
No, you're supposed to say stay safe. And so I was waiting for you to, you didn't say the line, so I had no jump in. Not my fault.
True.
Leave that in. Charlene making a mistake.
Okay, whatever. Stay safe and
ciao for now.